Well, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our faculty lecture series and to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Dr. Tiyi Morris, who is an assistant professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. She got her BA, I'm sorry, let me pop this out. She got her BA in 1994, I think, or 94, from Emory University, and from there went to DePauw, where she served as a postdoctoral fellow and then an assistant professor before coming to Ohio State and to this campus in 2006. I think it was in the fall of 2006. And since arriving at Ohio State, Tiyi has become a really well-rounded professor, excelling in all aspects of her job. And she has a book that's due out soon. Its title is We Who Believe in Freedom: Women Power Unlimited and the Black Freedom Struggle in Mississippi. And I know from her department chair, E.K. Newsom, that this book is more than just the milestone that an assistant professor has to pass to earn tenure and promotion. It's going to make a major contribution to the field. And Tiyi has also been a fine campus citizen, contributing in many ways to campus life. She served on several campus committees. She's serving right now as Secretary of the Faculty Assembly, which means she's on the Faculty Assembly's Executive Committee. And she's also contributed through numerous activities and programs. Some examples include the Fresh Image First Year Experience Program, the Student Leadership Retreat, and the Images of Diversity Program, all of which are offered by Multicultural Affairs in our Office of Student Life. And Tiyi has in fact contributed so much to the advancement of the work of that office that it's no surprise the Office of Multicultural Affairs and Student Life has given her 2 awards. First in 2010, which was their Essential Peace Faculty Staff Award, and then in 2012 they gave her the Above and Beyond Faculty Staff Award. But her service extends beyond the campus to her profession. She's had several speaking engagements over the years since she's been here, including at institutions such as Fannie Lou Hamer National Institute on Citizenship and Democracy and the Children's Defense Fund, as well as Humboldt State University and College of the Redwoods, and the Unita Blackwell Young Women's Leadership Institute. As I mentioned, though, Tiyi's really well-rounded, so I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about her teaching as well. She's been very involved in helping us offer service learning experiences for our students, and in fact, she developed a course. It's a women's gender and sexuality studies course on gender, sex, and power, and she has a service learning component in that course that she's expanded with the help of 2 grants. One which was part of Ohio State Service Learning Initiative, a Service Learning Initiative grant, and one grant from the Ohio Campus Compact, which is one of their Pay It Forward grants, which is really fantastic because it's a grant that supports a professor who teaches a course and gets her or his students involved in the community in some way. And so the Ohio Campus Compact awards dollars to the faculty member who then, with the students, works with the community organization and selects an organization for those dollars to go to. It's really a fantastic thing for the campus in terms of our outreach and engagement. In Tiyi's case, this particular grant and course involved working with an organization in Licking County that deals with issues that are of importance to women and girls. And through the course, students saw, and I'm using Tiyi's words, theory, the connection between theory and practice, and they learned how to apply, they learned how important feminist philanthropy is, not only to sustaining the feminist movement, but also to having a direct impact on the quality of life of women and girls in the students' communities. Tiyi's students have great admiration for her teaching, and I'd like you to consider a few comments. These are really fantastic. This was my favorite class because it was continually interactive and stimulating. I enjoyed going to class, and I feel like I learned something new every day. Dr. Morris was excellent at encouraging everyone in class to participate. Here's another one. This professor is absolutely wonderful. I would recommend this class to anyone. I learned so much from this class. I love the professor and her teaching style. Here's another one from a brand new student, first semester. I would just like to say that coming into this course, being one of 3 men in the class, I was very nervous. Now, at the end of the class, I can honestly say that this class has changed my life and my views on so many things. Dr. Morris was an outstanding, and outstanding is all uppercase, teacher, and really helped me excel in the class. I'm very thankful to have had the opportunity to take a course like this and to have Dr. Morris as a teacher for my first semester of college. Another one, absolutely love this course. Dr. Morris is a good professor. She is very passionate in what she teaches, with 4 exclamation points. Considering such phenomenal praise, I plan to put myself in the role of a student tonight as Tiyi teaches us about the unknown women of the 1964 Mississippi Summer Project. I invite you to do the same and to help me welcome Dr. Tiyi Morris. There you go.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? All right, good evening. Let me begin by thanking Dr. Bill McDonald for inviting me to give this talk this evening, as well as the administrators and staff who helped make the arrangements, and of course all of you for coming out tonight. Now, 2014 is a significant marker in civil rights history. We are 50 years removed from one of the most transformational eras. Do I need to speak up just a little? Oh, okay. Is this better? Okay. We are 50 years removed from one of the most transformational eras of our nation's history. This summer, activists, scholars, and youth from across the country will be participating in various celebrations to commemorate and reflect upon the activities of those who worked during the summer of 1964 as part of the Mississippi Summer Project, also known as Freedom Summer. Youth activists in general and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activists in particular were the foot soldiers of this summer project, risking their lives to bring equality to Black Mississippians. At the same time, women of their mother's generation worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the project's success, raise the activists' visibility, and increase civil rights activism among their peers. My presentation this evening will focus on some of these lesser-known women who engaged in civil rights activism, as well as the practice of other mothering to sustain and support the movement. Other mothering is used to describe the process by which Black women, whether biological mothers or not, have engaged in the caretaking, the sharing of material resources, mentoring, and emotional and psychological nurturance to help community members withstand the blows of racist and sexist oppression and to ensure the survival of the race. I also think such a characterization is aptly suited to describe these women because they, like many mothers, work tirelessly, not asking for recognition and sometimes being taken for granted for the essential work they contributed. So again, I'm grateful for this occasion to discuss the integral roles women have played in advancing social justice. I want to begin by briefly discussing Black women's activism, so a little bit of a theoretical framework for the research. So although my focus this evening is on both Black and white activists, the space in which these activists worked was one created by Black women's organizations. Black women occupy a unique space in the American landscape, living at the intersection of race, gender, and class oppression, among others, has given them unique insights into how these oppressions interact and has resulted in multiple forms of subjugation. Black women activists viewed themselves as mothers of the race and as the natural leaders of the struggle because of this intersectionality. While continually subjected to dehumanization and marginalization, Black women often interpreted these varied forms of oppression as advantageous in devising strategies to eliminate all forms of oppression and considered themselves better prepared to create strategies to simultaneously eliminate these multiple oppressions. This view resulted in liberation strategies that stressed the centrality of women's activism based on the premise that Black women's liberation will provide freedom for all oppressed peoples. These beliefs resulted in redefined their experiences in terms of institution building, institutional transformation, and resistance, rather than by suppression and marginalization. One collective of activists who built upon this Black women's organizing tradition during the Civil Rights Movement was Woman Power Unlimited. Woman Power Unlimited was brought into existence in May of 1961 from the divine inspiration of Clary Collins Harvey. Mrs. Harvey was a local activist and businesswoman. She owned a funeral home. It was a funeral home that her father started when she was young. And so essentially what this meant was that she was middle class. It also meant that she had a freedom and flexibility to openly participate in the civil rights movement, because unlike other middle-class Black individuals, she didn't have to worry about being subjected to economic intimidation. So her clientele was all Black. Of course, again, this is the 1960s. Most of her suppliers were from out of the state, so again, she didn't have to worry about any type of economic retaliation or of losing her job. So this was a unique experience for her and for some of the women that she worked with. She was she was active in the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, as well as in the Methodist Church. So what happened was in May of 1961, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, sponsored a project called the Freedom Riders. And this project was for a group of an interracial group of activists to travel from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, Louisiana, on the Greyhound bus. So they were going to be an integrated group. Blacks sat in the front, whites sat in the back. They sat next to each other. And this was because in 1960, a Supreme Court decision had declared interstate transportation illegal. Segregation on interstate transportation illegal. So they decided to test this. So they traveled throughout the South. Their original plan was to go to New Orleans. They ended up getting stuck in Mississippi because the governor of Mississippi said that he would not have all the violence that had occurred in Alabama. So as soon as they stepped off the bus, all the Freedom Riders were immediately arrested. Mrs. Harvey was at a Methodist convention, and she was sent with 2 ministers to go to the trial of the Freedom Riders because some Methodist individuals had been detained in that group. At the trial, she noticed that some of the girls were shivering. And these were college-age, kids. They were young. She was in her mid-40s by this time, so they were like children to her. She saw that they were shivering and thought, okay, well, what can I do about this immediately? She was, supposed to be thinking what they, as the Methodist Church, could do long-term, but her immediate response was, how am I going to take care of them right now? So she sent some clothes over to the church that night. And then she learned that they were not going to post bail, that they were going to serve their 39-day sentence, not in jail in Jackson, but at the Parchman Penitentiary, which was the longest time they could serve without losing the right to appeal. So this happens on a Friday night. So then she decides, okay, they're going to be here long term. What can I do to obtain more money to get more resources and supplies for them? So she sends out a call through the local Black churches. She's got 2.5 days, really. So she asks ministers to take up a collection specifically for the Freedom Riders. And she, in that short span of time, raises $145, which is no small sum. That would be equivalent to about $1,100 today. So she decides, okay, this was a very good response on such short notice. How can I capitalize on this? Obviously women are interested in supporting the civil rights movement. I think now is the time to create an organization specifically for women in Mississippi. Whoops, wrong way. And this is just a picture of her business in the heart of the Black community. So she had visibility in a variety of different ways. So she says that she was divinely inspired to create this organization called Woman Power Unlimited, so women could have a specific organ through which to support the civil rights movement, the Freedom Riders specifically. The first woman that she calls upon to assist her in this endeavor is Mrs. AME Logan, and that was her name, AME, named after the African Methodist Episcopal Church, of which her father was a minister. And she too was a middle-aged woman at the time, and she too was an independent businesswoman. So she sold cosmetic products from a Black company based in Detroit. So again, her clientele was all Black, her suppliers were out of the state, so she also did not have to worry about economic intimidation. So this was the first woman she called, and she became the executive secretary of the organization, doing the day-to-day operating, contacting people, disseminating information, organizing on the ground, so to speak. Mrs. Logan was also heavily involved in activism in the community as well, through her church, through women's groups, and through the NAACP. And this was her house, very close to Jackson State College, now Jackson State University, so really also in the heart of the Black community. And when I interviewed her back in 2000, I believe, she told me that, and you can see it's a very small house, but that she housed hundreds of civil rights activists. She hosted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a few times. And so people knew that if they were coming to Jackson and they needed a place to stay, they could always go to Miss Logan's house. You know, her kids said that they would come home and they would just see people sleeping all over the floor. So again, was considered the mother of the civil rights movement in Jackson, because she was there to provide that physical space as well as the psychological nurturance that the activists needed, both young and old. And then another core person on the executive board of this organization was Thelma Sanders, again, another businesswoman. She majored in home economics, and she was a teacher. But at one point, and if you know what it was like living in the South during this time, for black people, for example, if you went shopping, you couldn't try anything on. You had to buy it and hope that it fit, you know, and if it didn't fit, then you were stuck with it. So at one point in 1950, she had gone to a store to buy a house coat. And she asked if she could try it on, and the sales clerk told her no. She said that she would be happy to try it on for her, so she could see what it looked like. And she said that something clicked for her, that she decided, okay, you know, why can't we have our own store? You know, we need our own place so we can have a dignified space where women can come in, buy the clothes that they want, and feel comfortable and feel safe. So in 1950, she opened a store, Sanders Boutique, again in the heart of the black community, on the same street of Collins Funeral Home. So again, these women are working together, they're in the same organizations, working through the NAACP and women's organizations and through their churches. So Mrs. Harvey was a Methodist, Mrs. Logan was AME, and Mrs. Sanders was Episcopal. So they also had networks in various churches throughout the city. So again, a very good way to be able to mobilize diverse groups of people. And this is just a picture of Mrs. Sanders' house. Again, so you can see the economic wealth that these women had. Again, the flexibility to openly participate in the movement. And this is a picture of more of the executive board members, and you can see from the image that they are your typical middle-aged Southern church ladies, right, with the hats and the gloves. And so this was the collective of women that came together to support the Freedom Riders once they decided they were going to remain incarcerated in the Parchman Penitentiary, and once hundreds of people decided to converge on the state in support of the Freedom Rides. So the Freedom Riders were embraced by a community of women dedicated to advancing the black freedom struggle by ministering to the needs of the protesters. Women Power members attended to the physical, material, and emotional needs of the activists to ensure the manageability and success of their efforts. So in supporting the Freedom Riders, they provided toiletries for them, you know, shower shoes, soap, food, and many of them never actually got to meet the Freedom Riders while they were incarcerated because only ministers and their attorneys could actually go to the prison. So what ended up happening was that many of the Freedom Riders didn't even know that there was an organization. They knew that some women had donated some items for them, but they never actually got to meet them. And so that also made it difficult to try to reconstruct this history from the activist standpoint. But they provided toiletries, they contacted their parents for them, they helped get them transportation back home once they were released. For some of them, when they were released from the penitentiary, they went and picked them up because the penitentiary is about 45 minutes from Jackson. So for some of them, they would pick them up, give them a place to stay, give them fresh clothes. Sanders' boutique also had a beauty parlor in it, so she would do their hair and give the guys haircuts and things like that. So again, just really being there to provide this emotional and physical support for them. And I want to read an excerpt from a Freedom Rider from New York, Shirley Smith, talking about how important woman power was. She said, in the Mississippi State Penitentiary, I went through a grueling experience, a rough body examination by the jailers, meager food and water, and was placed in maximum security. And again, this is, you know, someone who's in her early 20s. Prison conditions were especially filthy, so packets of sanitary supplies and a bar of soap were received gratefully from a group called Woman Power Unlimited. It was a strange feeling to be released and walk out all alone. A black man approached me and asked if I were Shirley Smith. He represented Woman Power Unlimited and took me to a nearby Negro church. There were women waiting for me with clean clothes and a place to wash and warm food. I was then taken to a beauty shop where a black operator washed my hair, a blessing beyond description. Any one of these persons could have gotten into trouble, but in their wonderful communication system, I was cared for until I boarded the plane home. So you see why I want to thank Clary Harvey and Woman Power Unlimited on my own behalf and on behalf of other young people who needed some Mississippi citizen to take the risk of kindness for an outsider. And it was indeed a risk. This was Mrs. Sanders' car after her house was dynamited, in an attempted dynamite attack on her house. It destroyed the car instead. So again, even though these women were not out pounding the pavement like some of the young activists, they were still putting themselves and their families in grave danger. So the Freedom Riders collectively believed that woman power support was indispensable to their sanity and endurance. Supporting the Freedom Riders was the catalyst to increased civil rights activism on the part of middle-class, middle-aged Black women in Jackson. In the midst of Woman Power's broad-based platform that encompassed voter registration, boycotting campaigns, anti-poverty work, and peace activism, youth activists planned Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer was designed with the primary goals of bringing national attention to the state, getting people registered to vote, and organizing freedom schools and community centers. In doing so, civil rights activists hoped to focus attention on the plight of Blacks in Mississippi and to engender federal protection for the civil rights activists. In addition to campaigning for voter registration and political education, Freedom Summer organizers hoped to solicit support for the newly formed Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an independent organization founded to provide an alternative to the standard Jim Crow Democratic gatherings and to challenge the all-white Democratic Party delegation. Freedom schools were designed to improve the education of rural Black youth and raise their political consciousness by administering a curriculum focused on basic educational material as well as Black history. The community centers provided some of the basic needs that some of the basic needs of Blacks that had been ignored by social services, such as job training, prenatal care programs, and extracurricular activities for students. Consistent with this reputation for conducting grassroots operations, as the primary organizer of Freedom Summer through COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, SNCC drew on the support of other organizations and individuals and commits the program to organize, educate, and empower Black Mississippians. Although not involved in the organizing for Freedom Summer, Woman Power contributed in a variety of ways, from disseminating information to housing workers. Woman Power leaders regarded their exclusion from the planning as a definite oversight on COFO's part. In a report to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Harvey noted that, quote, "A better job might have been done from our viewpoint of housing, feeding, schools, etc., had COFO in its initial planning and continued programming included some of the Woman Power ladies and other women and men of the community," end quote. This was likely an oversight by an innocent oversight by the organizers, as COFO did not engage in much organizing in Jackson. In fact, some of the planners were from outside the state and simply did not know that the organization existed. Surely the NAACP would have known about Woman Power, though. Its leadership was not centrally involved in the planning process either. Despite the seemingly benign omission, this is indicative of the ways that women get marginalized in social movements as well as in the historical narrative. Once plans were in place, however, COFO did reach out to Woman Power for assistance in several ways, and Woman Power offered the project its full support. Learning from the experience with the Freedom Riders, Woman Power was aware of the positive impact moral and material support had on civil rights activists. They declared that visitors working in the Jackson community must feel our support for their efforts. Woman Power members felt an obligation to sustain the civil rights workers in the state because they knew that by doing so, they were sustaining the movement. The Summer Project appealed to Woman Power because its primary foci were initiatives that Woman Power had worked on, such as voter registration and community development. And the reliance on interracial cooperation was a likely bonus for Woman Power, because it too was a strategy its leaders believed was integral to effecting change. Hundreds of people, both Black and white, sojourned to and emerged from within Mississippi to reach the grassroots communities and uplift the masses of people who had been neglected, dispossessed, and disconnected. They were joined together by the common goal of fighting for consciousness raising among Blacks, fostering democracy, and fighting for quality of life issues. Woman Power made significant contributions of housing and food to support the Freedom Summer volunteers. These services were coordinated by Rosie Redmond, who chaired Women Power's Housing and Hospitality Committee. And again, this was important because they were trying to take care of civil rights activists who were coming through the state from basically 1961 to the late 1960s. The group subsidized local housing by supplying materials for 4 Freedom Houses in Jackson, which provided cost-free housing to civil rights volunteers. Women Power members raised funds and mobilized donations to furnish the Freedom Houses and stock them with linens and food. They provided accommodations in their own homes and sought additional space from friends. Jane Scott, for example, who was the only local white member of Women Power Unlimited, provided housing for Howard Romaine, a native of Louisiana and recent college graduate, as well as for other volunteers who were working with the White Folks Project. And the White Folks Project was based in Biloxi, Mississippi. It was the counterpoint to Freedom Summer, so they were engaged in organizing in white communities. In these homes, volunteers received comfort, support, and encouragement for their activism. Romaine recalled that staying at Scott's house was like being at home and that she was like some aunt or godmother. Again, propelled by a commitment to activist mothering, Women Power members expressed a genuine sense of caring for the volunteers and attempted to provide them with the physical and emotional sustenance to withstand the brutality of challenging Jim Crow in Mississippi. Like Mrs. Sanders, Mrs. Scott was also subjected to intimidation. One December, the Klan burned a cross on her front yard because, as you can see from the picture, she was also a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and she was the only woman on the Mississippi Commission. She was also very active in Church Women United, so because of her visibility, she was an easy target, so the Klan burned the cross. It was December, and she decided that instead of removing it, she would decorate it, and she put Christmas lights on it and kept it up as a way to demonstrate that she was not going to be intimidated by white supremacy. And that is indicative of all the women who participated in this organization, that they were simply unwilling to bow to, attempts of intimidation and harassment. Feeding the activists was another responsibility Women Power assumed. Initially, hot meals were served to the project workers at the COFO office during June and July. Monetary and food donations from Jacksonians, as well as from members of Women Power's chain of friendship outside the state, funded this operation. Mrs. Harvey was especially important in this endeavor because she was involved in a great deal of activism outside the state. She would eventually become the first Black president of Church Women United. So she had connections nationally and internationally, and through them she was able to solicit donations to help support Women Power's programs as well as the programs of other civil rights organizations in the state. In July, Women Power established a formal community food project in partnership with a local church, a local Black church, where they served meals daily. Approximately 85 people were served per day until the end of August. And so you had the COFO workers who were going there, you had individuals from the Medical Committee for Human Rights, from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and other workers, civil rights workers from out of the state, as well as local individuals. Women Power encouraged community involvement in this program by requesting that individuals and organizations volunteer to sponsor certain days. This served the dual purpose of sharing the financial and Woman Power costs, as well as providing an opportunity for community members to interact with the civil rights workers. Women Power supplied the Freedom Houses and Freedom Schools with snacks, breakfast foods, and fresh fruit. This was of particular importance to Harvey, who practiced a holistic lifestyle of healthy eating and exercise. Providing the activists healthy and nutritious meals was a priority for the women, as they envisioned this as a component of their nurturing as a form of resistance. For the Freedom Schools, Women Power provided library books, school supplies, and transportation for some of the students. Women Power's contributions had a profound effect on the activists who benefited from their work, as evidenced in a letter by the COFO staff and volunteers to the organization. They stated, "There is a very important way, perhaps the most important way, that the Mississippi Project has been able to be so successful. That is that all of the workers have been made to feel that you are really glad for us to be here. A very important sacrifice was made by the people in Jackson who are housing us and by the ladies in the community who fed us this summer every day, 6 days a week. We want to say something special to these ladies. They kept us healthy in a very real way, and we are very grateful to them. We will miss much more than the food, much more than the vitamins, and we thank you for the real sense of being cared for that you gave us this summer." The volunteers knew that their success depended upon the support and willingness of Mississippi residents, and Woman Power was responsible for providing and generating a significant part of that support in Jackson. Woman Power's contributions to Freedom Summer cannot be overstated, as they provided the basic means of survival for many of those volunteers who carried out the legwork of the project. The food project continued into the fall for the civil rights workers who remained in the state. Woman Power also provided the civil rights activists with the motivation and encouragement to continue their work. Just as it had supported the Freedom Riders, its members provided a fellowship of emotional and spiritual support for the civil rights workers who were challenging the racial injustices of the South. Woman Power's ability to generate resources for this project exemplified its commitment to sustaining the Mississippi movement and its dedication to improving conditions for local communities. Another key way that Woman Power contributed to Freedom Summer was through their assistance in establishing Wednesdays in Mississippi. Many civil rights activists were aware of the benefits of interracial activism. However, the reality of forming such alliances, particularly in the South, was an arduous, if not daunting, task. Such alliances expanded civil rights activism beyond the Black community and raised awareness that this was indeed an American problem, not just a Negro problem. Wednesdays in Mississippi was one such undertaking, designed to bridge the gap between Black and white communities and expand civil rights activism through consciousness raising and eventually direct action. Wednesdays in Mississippi, also known as WIMS, was sponsored by the National Council of Negro Women. Under the leadership of Dorothy Height, the council was instrumental in forming an interracial coalition of women's organizations that generated cooperative activism between Northern and Southern Black and white women. So in the fall of 1963, SNCC's executive secretary, James Foreman, and a staff member, Prathia Hall, sought out the council to assist them in dealing with the brutality that activists in Selma were facing. So as these activists were engaging in voter registration, they were subjected to extreme police brutality. Many of them young women being harshly treated. There are accounts of women being given vaginal exams by the police guards after they put on gloves and Lysol on their, on top of the gloves. And just the horrendous brutality of these searches, the kids didn't really know what to do. So they were seeking out a national organization that could help them address these issues. And so Height decided to go down to Selma with an interracial team. Again, very focused on interracial activism. So it was herself, Shirley Smith, who was the executive director of the National Women's Committee for Civil Rights. She was white. And then Dorothy Farabee, who was the director of health services at Howard University Medical School, Black. And then Polly Cowan, who represented the New York Citizens Committee for Children. So they decided that they would go to Selma and meet with the activists, talk to their parents. The Black women would go to the Black community. The white women would go to the white community. They're in Alabama. That's what you had to do. Unfortunately, the individual who was supposed to pick up Height and Farabee from the airport did not show. So they all had to ride in Cowan's rental car. So Cowan took them to a community meeting and decided that she would stay, that the white women would stay at this meeting. So they got to hear from the activists themselves, some of the young women who were in SNCC. They talked to their parents. They got this firsthand account of what it was like for these young people to engage in voter registration in the South. Because it was such a good meeting, the SNCC activists invited them to come to a freedom rally later that evening so they could talk about connecting the local with the national movement and how national organizations could support them. So then they all go to this meeting. Again, these 2 white and 2 Black women going to this Black freedom rally. So the next day, Smith and Cowan go meet with 2 local white women. And it was a difficult meeting, but they encouraged them and they finally get their commitment that they would meet Dorothy Tiyi, who worked with the Fellowship of the Concerned. And Dorothy Tiyi was a white woman, a Southerner, who was organizing and mobilizing white women to protest against the injustices to which Blacks were faced. So they agreed to meet. But then before Tiyi gets to Alabama, the newspaper publishes information about the Freedom Rally. And in the paper, they see that Cowan and Smith went to the rally, and these local white women felt betrayed. They were somewhat sympathetic to the brutality the students were being subjected to, but they felt that Cowan and Smith were, outside agitators, and now they were aligning themselves with this communist-inspired freedom rally, and so all the trust was broken. So they said that they wouldn't meet with Dorothy Tilley when she arrived in town. And so even though the relationship they were trying to establish with Southern white women was severed at that point, they learned a very valuable lesson, right? That they were going to have to approach Southern women in a very particular way, that they were going to have to be mindful of the status quo, you know, and how they interacted with these women. So specifically, they had to understand the social position of white women who might have been sympathetic to the civil rights struggle, but were bound by white supremacy and limited by social customs with whom they could associate. Despite white women's sympathies, the de jure and de facto segregation that permeated Southern society prevented blacks and whites from publicly interacting as equals. Even those women who were ready to deny such customs did not have the will or the desire in an equally patriarchal society to ignore their husbands' limitations on their activities. Furthermore, as members of the middle class, these women were also fearful of being ostracized by their peers. This was a valuable lesson that would be integral in the structuring of the women's program. So after they returned to Washington, D.C., they give a report to the YWCA, to the National Council of Jewish Women, the National Council of Catholic Women, and Church Women United. And the leaders of these organizations decided that they should come together to really figure out how they could collectively support youth activists in the South. And so they decide to convene a 3-day meeting, interracial meeting in Atlanta, and they invite women from various backgrounds, racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds, to meet in Atlanta to have this conversation. And so they get women from the cities that they think are the most problematic and cities where the organization, at least one of the organizations, has a stronghold. And so then invited to this meeting are some of the members of Woman Power Unlimited. Jane Scott, Clary Harvey, and Thelma Sanders are all at this meeting. So they arrive, and these women, about 75 of them, get an opportunity to talk to local activists and to talk about, you know, how they, as national organizations, could help on the local level. And then at one point during this workshop, they break up into smaller groups by city. And so you have black and white women from the same city who had never met, and they didn't know what the others were doing. And they realized the communication barriers that existed. And so when they got back to this large group and they were all giving reports about their cities, 2 common themes kept coming up. One, that they had no idea what was going on in the other community, and that perhaps they needed to engage in some type of consciousness raising to dispel misinformation. So what this meant was that the white community was getting misinformation about what was going on with the civil rights activists. So there were organizations like the Citizens Council in Mississippi, which people tend to characterize as like a middle-class clan, right? So they would, Mississippi. So they would be the people who managed banks, you know, so they would recall your loans. You know, they would, you'd have to pay your house note in its entirety, right? If they saw that you were a member of the NAACP or if you went and registered to vote. Because if you registered to vote, then it was mandatory to be published in the newspaper. And it was mandatory so they could see who the blacks were who were engaging in civil rights activism. So this was kind of behind the scenes economic intimidation that they had the power to exert. And so this meant that whites in Jackson and other southern cities were getting, you know, misinformation about the civil rights movement and who these activists were. And so various women suggested that these national organizations find a way to really get into helping people on the local level and helping these women bridge communications. And it was Clary Harvey who specifically said, you know, that interracial cooperation on the local level would require a force greater than these individual women, that they needed a national organization to come in and really guide them. So she proposed that Northern women visit Mississippi during Freedom Summer and capitalize on the national attention that was already going to be there. And she wanted them to act as what she called a quieting influence in areas that were racially tinged, to build bridges of communication between the black and white communities and to be what she called a ministry of presence. So this open invitation was for black and white Mississippi women to participate in a national movement and to participate essentially in Freedom Summer, as well as for activists from outside the state to lend their assistance with the civil rights agenda locally and nationally. Harvey believed that these women could engage in consciousness raising to assist in creating an environment conducive to change. She believed that by identifying with the movement and observing demonstrations or hearings without actively participating, Northern visitors could provide a ministry for sympathetic local white and black activists with whom they interacted. So then after this meeting in Atlanta, they go back to DC, and Haidt shares this information with Cowan, who wasn't at that meeting. And Cowan comes up with this idea to enlist what she called the Cadillac Crowd. So women of social and economic prominence, right, who would go down very much like the students and be volunteers. So just as many of the college students who were going to Mississippi to work in Freedom Summer were from middle-class families because they were volunteers, they needed the money. You know, you had to be financially secure to be able to just go down there and do that. They needed the same thing with these women. So they got women who were able to, you know, subsidize their own trips, but they also wanted women who had connections to national organizations and a great deal of visibility, right? So again, they could bring that national attention. So the National Council of Negro Women was the primary organization, and then they also worked with the other organizations who sponsored the Atlanta meeting, as well as the League of Women Voters and the American Association of University Women. So the structure was that they would have teams of women, you know, between 6 and 8 women, with at least 2 black women on each team. They would fly down to Mississippi on a Tuesday. That evening, they would usually go to a local event, be hosted by a local woman. And then on Wednesday, they would spend all day going out to various Freedom Summer projects. And then they would come back that night and go to a rally or an event, and then they would fly out Thursday morning. And they had these really short trips because they didn't want to be a burden on the local community. So they had 7 trips over the summer. And these are just some of the women who participated in the project. And going down there, because what they learned from Selma was that they had to adhere to segregation, right? So white women go to white communities, black women go to black communities. And so they would get down there sometimes on the same flight, and as soon as they stepped off the plane, they didn't speak to each other. You know, they would go in different directions. And one woman recounted, because they were required to do a report afterwards, and they had debriefing and everything, so they had a very good history. But one woman recounted, you know, basically when they crossed the Mason-Dixon line, I think this group was coming from Minneapolis, that the tenor just changed. They just kind of stopped talking. Previously, they had been talking across the aisle to each other. But once they reached the South, you know, they just stopped talking. And she said the vibe on the whole plane changed. You know, and by the time they arrived in Jackson, they knew that they couldn't speak to each other. And they were actually fearful at that point. And one of the women, Ruth Batson, actually almost didn't go. She was from Boston, and she didn't want to, you know, live by and follow the rules of segregation. So she almost didn't go, but she eventually changed her mind. So the women, again, were Northern women, prominent women who participated. And during the summer of 1964, of the 48 women who went to Mississippi, 40 were college graduates, 15 of whom had advanced degrees. 29 were employed in occupations ranging from public school teachers and college professors to attorneys. And many had organizational affiliations, including the ACLU, the National Urban League, Girl Scouts, and Black Greek letter organizations. For example, Alice Ryerson from Boston was a school psychologist. Flossie Dedman was an associate professor of English at Coppin State College. Ilza Williams was the assistant principal at Clara Barton School in New York. Mary Kyle was a reporter for the Twin City Observer. And Marjorie Damon was president of Jewish Family Services of New York. So again, very prominent women were participating in this project. The staff, so they had staff in New York and they had staff in Mississippi. And the Mississippi staff had 2 paid members, Susan Goodwillie, who was a recent graduate of Stanford University, and she also took her roommate, who signed on as a volunteer. And then Doris Wilson, who was, like many of the Wednesday's women, middle-aged, middle class. She had spent time working with Dorothy Haidt, and had also worked for a number of years with the YWCA. And so these were the 2 individuals who were responsible for organizing and coordinating things in Mississippi. So Doris Wilson was able to find housing in the black community, but Goodwillie and Vivel actually had to rent an apartment because there were no local white women who were willing to put them up so they could engage in civil rights activity. So between July and August of 1964, 48 women and 7 interracial teams traveled to Mississippi. So this is just where they went. And I'm going to provide a description of one of the trips to give you an impact of give you an idea of the impact they had and kind of what they were doing while they were down there. And the majority of this information comes from the report that Ruth Batson gave when she returned. So the Boston team included 8 women from Massachusetts and New York, and they departed from Mississippi on July 14, 1964. After arriving together on the same flight to Jackson, the women adhered to Jim Crow by separating without acknowledging each other. Ruth Batson was taken to the home of her hostess, a music director in the public school system. During the first day in Mississippi, Betson and the other black team members, Burl Morris and Ilza Williams, dined at Stephen's Kitchen, a black-owned restaurant well known for its support of civil rights activism. And then they attended an NAACP mass meeting. At this meeting, Betson witnessed the closed discussions among Southern blacks about the civil rights struggle. And she talked about how the ministers both scolded and praised the community residents for their support of the civil rights movement. So scolded them for not participating as much and then praising the ones who actually did. The remaining team members, Geraldine Collenberg, Alice Ryerson, Layla Wisner, and Pearl Willen, dined in Wisner's hotel room before their evening activities with local white women. Willen spent the evening with 12 local women at the home of Lillian Bernstein, whom she had met at the Atlanta meeting, as both were representing the National Council of Jewish Women. Willen's interactions with the local women were positive as they expressed a moral obligation to integration. Collenberg, Ryerson, and Wisner attended a meeting under the guise of the League of Women Voters at the home of Mrs. Rawls, who was the president of the League. About half of the dozen women in attendance at this function were opposed to COFO's invasion of the state with its summer project and looked down on the COFO workers, who they perceived as dirty and unkempt because of their unsavory appearance. These opinions were expressed despite the fact that those making such comments had not actually seen any of the COFO workers. Jane Scott, who helped arrange the meeting and transported the Wednesday's women to Rawls' home, was the only local woman to defend the civil rights activists and was the only one to have had any contact with the volunteers or really contact with blacks outside of an employee-employer relationship. Over the course of the evening, however, a few of the women seemed to quietly express open-mindedness to their visit and the presence of the civil rights workers, and were not appalled by the fact that Ryerson's daughter was actually one of the volunteers. So this was another way that they were able to get women to participate, that a few of them had children who were participating in the Mississippi Summer Project, so they wanted to be there to support their kids and to kind of see what they were getting involved in. On Wednesday, Betson and the other black team members traveled together to Canton, where they met the white team members. And there they met COFO Director George Raymond. They met people who were working with the MFDP, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They got to visit a community center and one of the freedom schools. And they were able to see the types of work that the volunteers were doing. They were able to see the level of engagement, how they were, raising awareness, the involvement of the children, and in spite of the dearth of resources, the dilapidated building, the insufficient materials, and the community center they went to, they had one typewriter for the 12 kids that were there that day, the old worn out instruments. And they said that in spite of all that there was this high level of engagement that they were just astounded by. So after visiting the Freedom School and the community center, they went to a local private school, basically. The Holy Child of Jesus Mission, a truly immaculate facility in comparison to the Freedom School. And the school was filled with unused supplies that were desperately needed at the Freedom Schools and Community Center. So at the suggestion of one of the team members, a COFO volunteer asked one of the nuns for advice. And so they began talking. The nun got his phone number, and it really just sparked an exchange that had not occurred before. And so by the time they left, Betson thought, okay, well, we've done something good here. We've created this bridge. This is just what we were hoping to do. Upon returning to her hostess's house that evening, Betson realized the fear of being a black person in Mississippi. Her report reveals her feelings of uncertainty and fear. She wrote, "I am frightened. As I lie awake, a car races by the house. When it races by again, I get out of bed and go stand in the hallway of the house. I feel like a small child. I am terrified. I want to cry. For this is Mississippi, and a racing car could mean so many things. The car races by 3 more times, and then all is quiet." Such experiences, which also included being followed and having one's license plate number written down and being badgered by local whites, resulted in a fear that was not always easy to shake. Similarly, Alice Ryerson recalled, "As we were astonished at how quickly we became suspicious of every expression on a white face, of every car and especially every policeman. Now that I am home, I jump at the sight of a white pickup truck or a state cop. It will take a few days to get over this." In spite of the lingering paranoia and uneasiness, this was in fact a good lesson to learn. It served as a reminder of Southern conditions and the vast amount of work that had yet to be accomplished. When Betson returned home, she immediately incorporated lessons from her Mississippi experience into her activism. Relieved to be home and safe outside of the Deep South, Betson recalled that, quote, "Suddenly I am overwhelmed by this big, big problem. I feel that I work so hard in this fight for freedom, but after Mississippi, this effort that I give seems almost negligible. The next morning, I arise to face reality in Boston, and I go down to the Democratic State Committee office to begin an effort to support the fight being waged by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party." So Batson was a delegate, so she was going to do everything, of course, to help seat the MFDP. Geraldine Collenberg left Mississippi with a reaction similar to Batson's, that she felt, quote, "permanently involved, no longer just on the fringes about civil rights." At the end of the summer, the 48 women who ventured to Mississippi met approximately 300 Southern women, about half of whom were white, representing a range of religious and political beliefs. During the fall of 1964, WIM's women debriefed, submitted reports, wrote articles for newspapers and organizational newsletters, raised money and sent supplies to the Mississippi projects, and assessed their accomplishments to determine future plans. Reports revealed that individuals were positively impacted by their experiences in Mississippi. They learned more intimately about the Southern struggle while realizing that it was not separate from the efforts they were engaging in their northern communities. Visiting Mississippi had given them a new insight into racial injustice and brought them face to face with their own responsibility to contribute to justice and equality. At the same time, it engendered in many a long-term responsibility to achieving social justice in Mississippi. Justine Randers Person experienced a, quote, "realignment of my own loyalties. Mississippi is somehow now my state, not the hated, disgusting white state, but the staunch Negro community that could enrich all America if only its forces could flow." In Polly Cowan's final report, she noted that, quote, "We found that our presence opened conversations between women of the South who never before have gathered to discuss openly their attitudes toward their problems. Many women who have felt completely alone in their thought discovered through our efforts that other women were like-minded and that it would be possible for them to work together. The women combined may have only spent a couple weeks in Mississippi working on the fringes of Freedom Summer, yet the impact of their exploits was far-reaching. In opening the lines of communication, especially intraracially, between Northern and Southern women, WIM's women helped lay the foundation on which Mississippi women could actualize their potential in effecting change. In respect to the Freedom Summer projects, the women provided emotional support to the volunteers and community members, as well as material support in the form of magazines, books, reams of cloth for sewing classes, literacy kits, art supplies, musical instruments, mimeographing and stenciling equipment, and of course money. Additionally, WIMS compiled a reminder list of materials needed by COFO for fall and winter programming, with items ranging from books, clothing, and household items to automobiles and building supplies. So again, they were keeping this kind of chain of friendship going where they continued to supply the COFO projects and SNCC projects with the resources that they needed. Similar to how Harvey, Logan, Scott, and Sanders, and other prominent women in Jackson brought legitimacy to the movement locally and engendered activism among their peers, Wednesday women were able, through Freedom Summer, to evoke support from white women in Mississippi and in their own communities. This sense of accomplishment was not limited to WIM's women. From the Southern perspective, Florence Gooch, one of the white Jacksonians who supported WIM's early on by hosting meetings with white visitors and her friends, concluded that WIM's was necessary groundwork. She wrote that while the social integration will not be acceptable here for a long, long time, at least the visits of intelligent, dedicated women of both races can be part of the bridge that will have to be built by all of us together. Gooch's comments speak to the utility of interracial cooperation and to women's effectiveness in bridging grassroots activism with the national movement and engendering activism among hesitant populations. WIMS provided an eyewitness to both on-the-ground and behind-the-scenes activities during Freedom Summer and created a national network of women who were concerned about and willing to work on behalf of the cause of human rights. Women Power Unlimited embodied the uniqueness of Black women's organizing tradition. It is a tradition that is informed by their intersectionality and demonstrates their ability to traverse organizational lines, simultaneously lead and support social movements, and link seemingly dissimilar organizations and issues. The organization is a testament to the love and leadership Black women have given their families and communities. Even more so, it is a testament to Black women's power to create an oppositional knowledge that allows them to articulate and work toward a humanist and democratic vision for all humankind. Including Woman Power Unlimited and Wednesdays in Mississippi fully into the civil rights narrative is essential to a more complete understanding of movement history, women's activism in general, and the strategy of interracial activism. It was these types of efforts that opened the closed society of Mississippi, and our collective consciousness must include the contributions of these women. Thank you.